emotional trauma for a second. Emotional trauma is probably the most underexposed risk factor for all major chronic illnesses in adulthood. And one of the ways that we know this is there was a set of really important studies done. The original one was called the Adverse Childhood Event Study. And it was done between 1995 and 1998. It was by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And they were looking at over 17,500 adults. And they basically surveyed everybody and asked them if they'd had an adverse childhood event, and that's known as an ACE. And then they correlated the number of ACEs that people were self-reporting with onset of chronic disease in adulthood. And the results were stunning. The researchers weren't expecting to get the results that they found. So first of all, 67% of all adults in that study reported they'd had at least one ACE. And of that, 80% said that they'd had more than one. And then the correlations were incredible as well. So for example, if you have a high level of ACEs, you have a dramatic increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death. If you had like 6 ACEs, for example, you have a 20-year reduction in lifespan. If you had 4 ACEs, you had things like a 400% increased risk of depression, of Alzheimer's. 2 ACEs is double the risk of autoimmune disease in adulthood. And for example, if you had 8 ACEs, you have triple the risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of heart disease. And one illness that I call like the poster child for ACEs was chronic fatigue, where if you have ACEs in childhood, you have a 6-fold increased risk of chronic fatigue in adulthood if you have 6. And that was similar to also things like fibromyalgia. So this is probably one of the most important studies done in medicine today, and it's one of the most underreported. And it really shows the bottom line is that, you know, emotions are fundamentally important. There's an emotional component to every chronic complex illness and every ailment that you can think of in most cases. In the study, what were they looking at when they were talking about these ACEs? So they were looking at things like parents separating or divorce, physical, sexual or emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, domestic violence, witnessing violence in a family, substance abuse and things like that. There were about 10 that they looked at, and essentially each one counted towards as one ACE, and there wasn't much difference between those. There was approximately the same impact of whether you had any of those kinds of things. But they also dramatically underestimated, even 67% was an underestimate because they missed ACEs. So they missed things like, for example, being a victim of, say, bullying, or, you know, there's all sorts of things they didn't include. Homophobia, there could have been financial stress in childhood, many things, even a traumatic birth is a huge trauma from childhood. A child being hospitalized for a chronic illness in childhood can be very traumatizing for a child as well. So, and also one other thing, emotional neglect is very hard to self-report. So probably when you're just asking somebody, you know, did you have emotional neglect or emotional abuse in childhood, many adults will probably say no, and it's not until they get in a skilled environment where a skilled practitioner is asking them, they'll actually be able to self-report and say, how are you supposed to know how you were meant to be treated in childhood? So the chances are probably nobody's unaffected by adversity in childhood. If you take that into account also with the fact that trauma is intergenerationally inherited. So you might look at your own childhood and say, well, I didn't really have anything, but what about your parents? What about your grandparents? Because, for example, third-generation survivors of the Holocaust victims have the same psychological and physiological expression as their grandparents. And that's been found across the world where there's been war and famine. You see it runs through the generations. And that's also been in mainstream studies now, showing in animal studies and so on, showing that trauma can be passed down through the sperm, interestingly, and through the female line as well, but through 7 generations. So this is a really interesting question about the role of epigenetics, and it turns out that's a really important factor in essentially how does childhood autobiography become adult biology. And essentially they were looking at three different aspects. There's three main aspects about how ACEs affect children, and we get this expression of illness in adulthood. One of them was behavior. Another one is the biochemistry, and this is where epigenetics comes in. And another aspect is the beliefs, the impact that ACEs have on beliefs. So if you have a high level of ACEs, you have a dramatic increased risk of behaviours that are destructive to health. So for example, if you had 4 ACEs, you're more than 7 times as likely in adulthood to become an alcoholic. You're more than 3 times as likely to engage in risky sexual behaviour. You're over 11 times as likely, for example, to use injection drugs. So obviously that is impacted, it impacts behaviour, essentially addictions and so on, because unresolved trauma creates pain, and therefore it leads to behaviours to numb the pain. But there was an amazing statistic from the original paper that showed that you could essentially have, not be a diabetic, have normal cholesterol, have a good weight, you were a good BMI, didn't smoke, didn't drink, but if you had 8 ACEs, you still had a 360% increased risk of heart disease. So it can't just be behaviour. And this is where the epigenetics came in. Now, there were some major researchers that started to look at what actually happens to children at the time of the trauma, and they started out with animal models, and then they also confirmed their findings in children. And what they found is essentially they started out and found that early life stress changes the expression of the glucocorticoid receptors. So essentially the body resets itself from the date that the trauma happens. And this is very important because it also explains why you may have had an early life trauma and that you don't remember it, but the body remembers, and the body has actually reset itself. So essentially what's happening is there's a reset of the basically the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the stress axis, is now set where essentially you need less stress to cause a stress response, and you have a heightened response for longer so your whole system's reset. And essentially they found that by using it in sort of rat and mice experiments where they would do early separation and separate the mother from the pup rat. And they found those responses, and then they were also able to replicate it and found it in humans as well. So that's the first thing. But the main thing is, so that was an epigenetic shift that happened, but it wasn't just the glucocorticoid receptors. It was other researchers found that it changes the epigenetic expression of the entire human genome. Genes linked with all the types of chronic illnesses, genes expression that change towards propensity to diabetes, cancer, mental and psychiatric imbalances, and so on. So essentially you have this biochemical reset that trauma brings on through the change in the epigenetic expression. And essentially, that reset is in place from the date the trauma happened, and some of the researchers said, it's as if they are marinating in inflammatory cytokines from that change in genetic expression from a very young age. And it only takes a trigger in adulthood for, say, the autoimmunity or whatever it is to express. But in truth, the illness started many years ago when the trauma happened. I think that blocked emotions and emotional trauma it works at a multifactorial level. So in the beginning, the epigenetic change changes the biochemistry, it changes the gut flora, it changes the way that the immune system's functioning, and that has a impact on the brain. So we know, for example, that if you change the gut flora, and stress and early life trauma totally will change the gut flora, leading to leaky gut and things like this. But we know that if you change the gut flora, that will also change somebody's propensity to anxiety and depression. So that we know, for example, that underlying anxiety and depression, gut dysbiosis is associated with that. You can actually treat it now. They're looking at treating PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, with probiotics. But emotions aren't just working at the biochemistry level. Emotional trauma also is a trauma happening in the energy field, or you could say at the electromagnetic level. And emotions have charge, And when we are in trauma, if we don't get to release the trauma at the time that it happens, it's not just the change in the HP axis that resets. There's also a trauma that's frozen into the energy field, and it directly affects the nervous system as well. So we're not getting this release that we need. And essentially it's frozen. So that is definitely, emotional trauma is distorted information in the energy field. It is also frozen into the nervous system, and the nervous system, that's where the aches and the pains come from, when literally the nervous system is kind of stuck, frozen, and the body becomes stuck into a frozen state as well. Emotional trauma, it is multifactorial, but emotional trauma, emotions aren't just neurotransmitters. They're not just from our hormones. They don't just come from our neurotransmitters. They are also electromagnetic, and they directly interact with the nervous system. So the third thing is that ACEs also impact behavior and identity. And the type of impact it has on behavior and identity leads to changes and essentially what you could call sabotaging behavior, which would lead to adverse health outcomes. So for example, the original ACE study actually started in an obesity clinic in Kaiser. It was Felitti, the researcher that was running the clinic, and the clinic was very successful. People were losing weight, but they had a 55% dropout rate, and they couldn't understand why. So they decided to investigate and ask what was happening, because people would be doing really well, and then all of a sudden they would start to get anxious, they would start to sabotage what they were doing. And by mistake, they started to find out that a lot of the people in the study were reporting sexual abuse in childhood. And one woman summed it up when she said, essentially being overweight was a form of protection. It was a protection mechanism against unwanted male attention. So this is directly, if you think about that, that is a healthy plan for somebody, and i.e. being thin, which is healthy. It was a threat to her identity. It was a threat to her very being. So we see that across the board. This is where I also think it shows up a lot in fatigue and chronic fatigue, where part of the type of trauma that you can have, a lot of chronic fatigue people have, is what's called attachment trauma, and it's very early life trauma, which leads to basically what you could call self-love deficit disorder from a very young age. And people have to find ways to make up for that. So they become achievers, or they become sort of the overdoers, overgivers. And these are the types of behavior that they found to cope with to earn love, because they're not feeling it, because they were traumatized as children. And you see these kinds of actually more subtle addictive behaviors like workaholism, that there's many, that will actually, when somebody's trying to implement a health regime, they're going to sabotage it. They're not going to be able to stick to it, because at some level, at the unconscious level, it's a threat to them. And if you don't deal with that, you're not going to have, as a practitioner, you're not going to have compliant patients, and as a patient or a client, you're not going to be able to stick to your plans. So that's one part of it. The other part is the direct impact that ACEs would affect people's belief systems about themselves. So if you have ACEs, there tends to be internal belief systems going on, such as, that probably is unconscious to the person, such as that they don't deserve health, that they deserve to have suffering. And these are unconscious sabotaging beliefs that can work directly on the biochemistry. We all know the placebo effect. We know that the placebo effect now has, I think 33% of the effectiveness of all medications and drugs is down to placebo. So there's no question about the power of the mind over the body. But there's also nocebo, which is a strong negative belief that something is going to make you worse, will. Well, ACEs can create a lot of unconscious sabotaging beliefs. And I see this many times with my own clients and patients, where they can be actually even compliant with the protocol, be doing brilliantly, they're totally committed and want to get better, and have tried everything, and something's just not working. And it's not sometimes until we delve into the deeper emotional stuff, and we actually go backwards and we look back, and we actually find that there are these sort of unconscious sabotaging beliefs. And truly, this is why I say the future is the past healed.